In this episode, you will discover why career transitions trigger imposter syndrome and grief, and how finding your Ikigai can help you overcome them. Welcome to the Midlife Reinvention Podcast, a podcast helping women in career and life transitions achieve clarity on their next steps so they can transform uncertainty into an energizing next chapter. I'm your host, Kavita Ahuja, and the founder of It's My Time Now Coaching. If you're wondering what's next in your career or life, you are in the right place. Through solo and guest episodes, you'll gain practical tips, tools, and inspiration to help you uncover blocks, gain confidence, and be, do, and have what you want. I rediscovered myself after the age of 50, and I know you can too. It's my time now to help you do just that. I'm so excited you're here. Let's dive in. What happens when your career, the one that defined your identity, is suddenly ripped away? How do you recover, rebuild, and step into your next chapter with confidence? Losing a job, stepping away from a long-term career, or experiencing a major professional shift can feel like losing a piece of yourself. In this powerful episode, certified coach and grief recovery specialist Laverne McKinnon shares powerful insights on how to navigate career grief and break free from imposter syndrome so you can step into your next chapter with clarity and courage. In this episode, you will discover how career grief keeps you stuck and how to finally move forward, the 5 types of imposter syndrome and how to break free from self-doubt, and why choosing courage over confidence is a secret to bold reinvention. So if career setbacks or imposter syndrome have been holding you back, this episode will give you the mindset shifts that you need. And don't forget to stay till the end for key insights in how you can rewrite your story. Welcome to the Midlife Reinvention Podcast, a career and life transitions podcast. If you're asking yourself, what's next? You are in the right place. I interview incredible women across the globe for this podcast who share their stories of reinvention and who will give you their insights and expertise on how to rediscover who you really are, what you really want, and how to get there in your next stage of life. This week, I'm really happy to have on the show Laverne McKinnon. Laverne is a certified coach and a grief recovery specialist, and she helps ambitious professionals navigate career transitions, whether that's climbing the ladder, recovering from setbacks, or confidently embracing new chapters. I am really thrilled to have you on the show today. Laverne, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Kavita.
So Laverne, I always like to kind of start with telling our audience a little bit about your story. You were a former senior VP of drama development at CBS, and you were at the pinnacle of your career, and I believe it was one of the network's best years. And yet, however, after almost a decade of steady promotions, you were unexpectedly fired. So please share a little bit about that, about your story, and how did this job loss kind of, I guess, lead to your own reinvention?
I love that we're jumping right into the deep end.
Yeah.
Ripping the Band-Aid off.
Yes.
As you stated, I had a really amazing run at CBS, the broadcast network that is primarily known for procedural shows like CSI and Criminal Minds. And I was part of the team that developed those shows and helped take the network from last place to first. And after 10 years, I was unexpectedly fired. The rug was completely pulled out from underneath me. And to give a little bit of context to that, I am someone who is ambitious, really driven, and I took deep satisfaction out of the fact that I was promoted every 18 to 24 months. And my identity was so tightly woven into being a successful executive, being a part of a successful team. And in the position that I had was, it gave me a lot of access and it was a platform. And when I lost that job, it really put me into a tailspin. And to be quite honest, it took me almost 10 years to recover from that.
Wow.
And I was really burdened with a lot of negative self-talk because I didn't understand why I wasn't able to bounce back from this significant experience. And I went on to have like other amazing jobs. I was the first programming chief at Epix. I had a production company. I sold television shows. I was an executive producer on a Netflix series. And
Okay.
yeah, and inside, I felt horrible.
Yeah.
And so that ultimately led me to this reinvention, to becoming a coach who helps people with transition, because I don't want anyone to ever experience what I experienced, or feeling less than because of a disruption or setback in career. And essentially what I recognized was that I was grieving the loss of my job, but I didn't understand that it was grief. And
Yes.
because I wasn't giving myself a mourning process, I was stuck in that grief.
Wow. When we're in the thing, when we're in our careers and we're climbing the ladder, and like I like what you said earlier, that your identity was so woven into your career, and that often is what happens, right? Is like we almost lose our identity. It's just the job becomes really our identity, right? And to lose that so drastically and unexpectedly, I mean, yeah, even though you went and had other positions and other jobs, it's very dramatic. So you mentioned that you realized that it was a career grief. It was a grief that you were going through, but can you describe what that is, and how did you, well, firstly, how did you identify it? And then maybe how did you kind of work through it, and how, if people, if anybody else who's listening who maybe had these triggers that are leading to these transitions, like whether it's a loss, job loss, or other things in life, maybe divorce or some other kind of loss, how do we get over this, or at least try to?
Yeah, it's well, the first thing I want to share before I directly answer that question is that in Western society, our jobs are our identities. It's like the first thing that people ask is when they meet us is like, "Oh, what do you do?"
Yeah.
And so that messaging is just becomes almost like a part of our DNA. And specific to setbacks or job loss, whether it's being early retirement or being laid off or being fired in my case, it falls into this category that's called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is any type of loss that's not openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly mourned. And this was a term, disenfranchised grief, that was coined by a bereavement expert by the name of Dr. Kenneth Doka. And I really focus on career grief, but as you mentioned, Kavita, it can be anything from divorce, pet loss, moving. It really can encompass any type of category, in that what one person might say, what's the big deal? You went on to something else, or you can get another pet, or it's like you can find a new partner. Our loss is really dictated by the depth of our attachment. And so, because for me, I was so attached to my job, the loss was significant. Where I've had colleagues who've been fired and it's like, you know what? I didn't like that job anyway. It's like, move on to the next.
Yes.
So, like, one of the first steps is to really be able to look at the loss and the sense of attachment to that loss. And if it is deep, then it may require a mourning process.
I love that the loss is dictated to the depth of the attachment. It reminds me of I had a client who, it just struck me when you were talking, because she came to me because she had a business that she had started, and initially it was very successful, and she had started it with her daughter actually, and it was very successful, but she ended up having to close it. And she was so attached to it, like it was part of her. Like she said, she goes, Kavita, this is my identity. And I just don't know how to deal with it. And so the work was to help her realize what her identity actually is. It's apart from the work, right?
Yes.
So I think that kind of, that example just stuck in my head when he said that. So
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that identity component is so critical, because one of the first things that I have a framework that I called Learn, Learn, and it's inspired in part by the work of Mary Frances O'Connor, who wrote an incredible book called The Grieving Brain. And while that book is specific to bereavement and the loss of a loved one, it's the idea that as human beings, part of what makes us so unique is our ability to learn. And so that we can learn to grieve. And so that first component is identifying, as we just talked about, what is the loss?
Yes.
And let's say it is identity, because it is for many, many people, whether it's a project not being able to move forward or tanking, something like that. And so then we look at what is the meaning. So we want to examine the meaning that we associate with that loss. And so, okay, if I'm no longer the senior vice president of drama development at CBS, then who am I? And so what I started to create was, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, I'm worthless, I'm not worthy. And so then the next thing that we do in order to create a structure around the mourning process is to address the pain of that. And so I coach clients around creating a ritual. So, for example, a lot of the people that I work with come from a creative background. So writers who maybe have not been able to have their work published, or their work is not well received, they'll print out a copy of their work, and then they actually bury it, and then they write a eulogy.
Wow.
And say those words. And it's like, rest in peace. And it's quite moving, because they can really honor and say, I'm so sorry. I was not able to bring you to full term. I was not able to meet the potential or reach the possibility of this job or this project. And so that ritual component, much like we have a funeral or memorial service, we can apply that to career setbacks and disruptions. And through that ritual, then we're able to really reframe the meaning of the loss and what we created. So I was able to move from, oh, I'm a loser, I'm worthless, I'm a failure, to, oh, that job was no longer a match for me. And I sort of, my time at CBS was, I sort of grew up there, and I was like a rebellious teenager. And it's like, okay, so that's like a new meaning that I began to create. And then we find agency. That's the last step of the mourning process, is to regain that sense of control, because career disruptions, they really can make us feel like we've lost anchor and that we're unmoored.
Wow, that must be a very powerful exercise to do that, like the actual ritual of burying whatever you're grieving. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are all different types of rituals that we can create. Like I've had clients create playlists because they really love music. And so they choose songs that reflect the experience that they're having. And it's quite cathartic.
Laverne, based on your experience working with clients, and you kind of mentioned it, but how do we move from this kind of, when we have this loss, from kind of an uncertainty in our careers to somewhat of a stability? I read your latest blog, and in it you shared, it was talking about reshaping your story after a career challenge. And you share that rewriting your story doesn't erase the setback, it reframes it. I think you touched a little bit on there, but maybe there's some other elements in there that you'd like to expand on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to this core theme that's really bubbling to the surface in terms of our conversation around identity and uncertainty. Really, in my experience, it stems from the relationship that we have with not knowing what the future holds. So if my identity has been ripped out from underneath me, how am I going to regain that sense of safety and security that my identity brought to me? And unfortunately, the hard truth is that we can't predict the future. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen. And so the stability actually comes from reconnecting with our core values, with our purpose, because our purpose is not our job. Our purpose is not our career, despite, I think, a lot of societal influences that tell us that that's true. And we so over-index in our society in terms of believing that our jobs are our identities. So reconnecting with the things that are truly important to us and our why helps us regain that sense of stability, because it's no longer contingent on the job or the identity that the job has brought us. So rewriting the narrative really comes from being able to gain clarity around what are my values. And so if I can just expand on that a little bit more in terms of my experience, when I was at CBS and thinking, again, I'm a horrible person, I'm a failure, and I'm a loser, and again, this took me 10 years to get to. And not everybody has to have 10 years. I'm hoping that through by listening to your podcast, that we can collapse this for people.
Or working with you, yeah.
Yeah, is that as I grew up over that 10-year period of time, that I started, my values had shifted.
Yes.
And that, for example, I started to value having my own voice. I began to value my contribution. And I started to speak out more in meetings and having a dissenting opinion. And the culture of CBS at the time that I was working there was that management really valued like blind loyalty. It was actually not okay for me to have a dissenting opinion. And so there's a real clash of opinions there and values. Another value that I had was transparency. And at the time, CBS did not value transparency. They actually was very important to withhold information in order to maintain what they believed was a competitive advantage. And so I was really rebelling against those values. And so as I began to understand what happened, I was able to rewrite and reframe my story of, in some ways, I was a rebellious teenager, but the truth was that my values were no longer aligned with the company that I was working with, which is why ultimately I was no longer a fit.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Actually, that really aligns with what I take my clients through as well, because when they're experiencing this kind of these triggers and that leads into a transition and it's like, what's next? What do I do? And it usually is, as you said, related to work. And so it's about taking a step back and saying, well, I go through the process of helping them find their Ikigai, right?
Yes.
And so the components of that are your strengths, your passions, and your values, which you mentioned, right? Mm-hmm. And they change over time. And if they're not aligned, and if the sweet spot is not there, then that's where you find the discomfort. And it could have been okay maybe 10 years ago because your values were different. But as we go older or we have different experiences, then if that sweet spot is not being met in terms of our reason for being, then that's where I think that discomfort is, or the uncertainty starts, right? So
indeed. And I feel like we've had an opportunity to talk a little bit offline, and if it's okay, so I almost like want to flip the script a little bit, because you had that experience in terms of your transition. Now you weren't laid off, you weren't fired, it was a choice. Yes. And I'm sort of curious if you experienced any type of loss from your career transition, even though it was your choice and you were driving it.
Oh my God, 100%. 100%, because I was always used to being very successful at what I was doing, knowing that I had the support system and the comfort of like a regular paycheck. I had a team around me, and then all of a sudden I was alone. Now I'm an entrepreneur and I have to figure it all out. And that can be very daunting. And yes, I was very excited, but at the same time I felt the loss in a lot of ways. In answer to your question, yeah, I think I did have a bit of a grieving period, even though I did leave on my own terms. So that's what I also talk about a lot is those triggers that I talk about that a little bit, and in terms of the stages of a transition. So the first stage is a trigger, and it can be dramatic trigger like you had, like a layoff or firing, or it could be that internal feeling that we have, which I had, that something is not aligned, like we were talking about, right? And that can also be the trigger to like, okay, what's next? So it doesn't have to be so dramatic, but in both ways, if I, now that you brought it up, in both circumstances, there is probably that grieving period, right? Yeah.
Yes, because of that attachment to the safety, the security, the stability of working in a corporate environment. And
yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because it falls into that category again of disenfranchised grief, where society has grief rules. Well, it's like, well, Kavita, it was your choice. Why are you feeling sad? Yes. Or even like divorce. It's like, you're the one who chose to divorce your partner. Why are you so bummed? It's like, you chose to sell your house and move across the country. Why are you feeling the sense of loss? And that, again, is like that not being publicly acknowledged or socially validated or supported. It's like, even if there's a choice here that you completely own, it doesn't mean that there isn't a sense of loss.
Yes. Yeah.
And so
Thanks for pointing that out. That's really, really great perspective. I never really thought of it that way. So thanks for opening that up. I wanted to kind of maybe switch a little bit. We talk a lot about here, and I'm sure maybe you've got clients as well who really deal with a lot of like imposter syndrome, right? And so when we do decide to rewrite a story, like for example, I went into entrepreneurship and there becomes this feeling of like severe self-doubt and feelings like, oh my God, I don't think I can do this. I'm an imposter. What are they going to find me out or all of those feelings, right? So any ways or tips that you have as women, especially, how do we rise up from these feelings of being an imposter?
Indeed. I feel like I say to my clients when they're experiencing imposter syndrome, I'm like, awesome. You're checking off the first box of like going on a new adventure.
Exactly, right?
Yeah, I feel like you're doing this right because the imposter syndrome has popped up. And I'm going to continue to go with this theme of identity. And the Imposter Syndrome Institute has talked about 5 different forms of imposter syndrome, which I thought was really interesting. The natural genius, superhuman, perfectionist, which that I really relate to, expert, and soloist.
Let's say those again. Natural genius.
Superhuman.
Yeah.
Perfectionist.
Yeah.
Expert, and soloist.
Okay.
And so those are all different aspects of identity. And so when imposter syndrome pops up, there's, as you've said, there's like a trigger, there's a task, an opportunity. We say yes. And then it's like, uh-oh. And like, for me, my perfectionism immediately pops up. And so the way that I've learned and the way that I coach clients around this is to really understand what's the identity that you're looking to protect, that the imposter syndrome is feeling threatened that, oh, you are going to be found out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, uh-oh, people are going to find out that I'm not perfect. People are not going to find out that I'm superhuman. People are going to find out that I'm not a genius. And the way through this is to embrace duality. So I am imperfect and I still fail. As a genius, it would be something like, I am intelligent and I still have things to learn. It's like the superhuman, which I look at as like, that's the person who feels like they can do anything. I can handle any role. So it's like, I wear multiple hats and I don't always wear them all well.
I love that.
Incredibly helpful for me to be like, I am
this, but, and also I am this. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it's replacing the but with the and.
That's wonderful. Wow. That's a really great way of reframing it. Yeah. Especially because, yes, I think, especially as women, I think we're so that being an expert or we have to be an expert in everything. And if we're not, then we feel less than. And it's like, oh, I don't think I can go for that job because I don't have 100% of the qualifications. And whereas often men will go for the job when they have like 65% of the qualifications, right?
Yes.
They don't have, often they don't have that feeling of having to be an expert or I'm not good enough or all these things. But yeah, that's great. The embrace duality. Love it. Have you had to do that yourself? Like, can you give me an example of like,
oh my gosh, constantly. I go back to this learning thing because of I'm a recovering perfectionist. And so I can publish my blog and I can edit it later. It's like, there's like the imperfection of, okay, I can fix a mistake. This is not chiseled in stone.
Right.
And so I do have people who will be like, there's a typo, or, oh, those two thoughts didn't connect. Or even when I read my blog out loud and I publish it as a podcast, and a really great social media manager who helps me with that. And she yesterday sent me, you use 3 different names with your client story. It's like, oh no. And I was such a perfectionist and I got triggered. But then it's like, wait a second, I can just re-record this.
Yes.
And then she was also like, I don't know if you have to re-record. I'm just going to edit some things out, but I just want you to be aware of mistake.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yes, it's like,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm confronted with it constantly.
Yeah. Well, people are, if you feel like you need to be perfect, then you're never going to put anything out there. Right? Like, or you'll be worried about what other people think, or like, especially if I found initially that happened to me when I was going out on social media, because I'd never really had to put myself out there before, like individually as like my brand, and
Yes.
did that a little earlier. And it's like, it has to be perfect. I have to, everything I have to say. But now it's like, I actually still really envy, or I'm really admire people who can really, like Mel Robbins, for example, like she just goes out there and just says whatever. And she's,
Yeah,
it's like, be like her, but you
it's so true.
know.
And I think it goes back to like the work that you do with Ikigai, because that when we know like our purpose, we know our why, we know our Ikigai, that
Yes.
it helps us, it helps me at least to say it's like a big, like my why is helping people across their finish lines. And so if I'm going to be, if I focus on that as opposed to being perfect, then I can push the
Mhm.
publish button. I can
Mhm. Mhm.
record something. I can do something that makes me feel uncomfortable. But if I'm focused on being perfect, then I can't push that button. But if I'm,
Yes.
oh no, if I'm going to be potentially help somebody with this information, then I have the courage to take that step.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Wonderful. Speaking of courage and confidence, that's another big topic we have here. And I call, like, despite setbacks that we have, how do we develop the confidence to go after that thing that we want to go after? You had written an article which described a late woman by the name of Macy Jemison, who was the first Black woman to travel into space. And it was interesting because you talk about the steps. What are some of the steps we can take, like May did, perhaps, to develop the confidence to achieve these bold goals? I mean, she had a huge, bold goal, right? It doesn't even have to be that big, but even a smaller goal, especially when we might be thinking like, oh, I'm too old to do this, or I'm not qualified again, or whatever. Like, what are some tips that you have about how to build this confidence?
Yeah. It's specifically with Mae Jemison is that when she was coming up, and the hard truth is it still exists now, is that there was real bias. This wasn't like made up. And you've probably talked about this in your work that imposter syndrome is not an internal belief system that we've made up. It actually exists. There are real biases that tell us that we are imposters or that we don't belong. And so for me, and what I think is really important is that we look at data over drama. And that's an expression that a business coach, Dallas Travers, had shared with me that I really love. And she sourced it from somewhere else. So data over drama is essentially saying, let's look at the facts, check the facts of, are you too old? Are you not qualified? And the truth is that may be true. It's like, we don't necessarily know. Now, should a 99-year-old be running a marathon? I don't know. I think it has less to do with the age versus the person's physical ability. Are you not qualified? I don't know. Maybe. It's like, look at the facts of, do you have the proper certifications or training or credentials? So, because I wouldn't want someone operating on me if they didn't have medical training. And so you really want to be able to look at the truth and not
Yeah.
assume that it is or isn't correct. And so, okay, and if there is something that says I'm not qualified, then we have the ability to learn and we have the ability to close the gap. And so I really like to focus on that data over drama. And then to what you said about confidence and courage, which then is whatever we need to close the gap, if it truly exists, is always choose courage first, because confidence is derived from experience. So if you have the courage to have the experience, then that experience will lead to confidence over time.
I love that. Always choose courage first. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, data over drama, because, yeah, I mean, it could be true. We could be old, but what does that mean, really? Right? I mean,
Yeah,
are you still energetic? Do you still have drive? Do you still have ambition? Even if you're 75 years old, doesn't matter.
exactly. So
You know?
true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
great. That's
Yeah.
really,
And then if the data is not there that says, I can't find any data that says I'm too old, then choose courage.
it's wonderful. Maybe you could tell our audience what's going on and what kind of things are you doing right now, where we can find you, and all that good stuff.
Oh, thank you for that invitation. I really do love helping people across their finish lines, especially when they're navigating a transition, whether it's a career disruption or they're looking to move up the ladder in some form. So I have a Substack that I would love to invite people to come to and subscribe to. It's Laverne McKinnon on Substack. And there's also a paid subscriber tier as well. It's $5 a month. I believe in transparency. And with the paid subscription tier, I offer co-working sessions over Zoom a couple times a month. We also, starting in March, I'm going to be dropping meditations as well. And then I'll be offering, starting in later April, a 5-part workshop over Zoom to help people with career grief. And so that's all part of the monthly $5 subscription. And if anyone is like, I'm having cash flow issues or whatever, just contact me through Substack and I'm happy to give anyone a free paid subscription. Because again, I don't want anyone to ever feel like they're less than because of a setback or a disruption in their professional life.
Wow, that's very generous. And that seems like a lot of wonderful information. And also you have a community right there that you can tap into for a very low price.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful community. And yeah, just like that sense of belonging that comes from saying, oh, I'm not the only person who experiences imposter syndrome. I'm not the only person who's been laid off.
Yes, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we'll have all the information in the show notes as well. But just before we go, Laverne, I mean, I told you earlier, you have a very calming presence. And just maybe a last word on how women who are listening, most of the listeners are women who are going through transitions in their career and life. And it could be what you and me discussed, could be internal, it could be an external thing that has happened. Any last words for you, for them to be able to, as you say, cross the finish line?
The one thing that I'd love to be able to offer or share, and this goes into the identity and disenfranchised grief component, is simply that there are unspoken grief rules of like, oh, if you are grieving, then you should be doing X or you should be doing Y. And the truth is, there are no grief rules, and that there are 2 types of grievers. There's like head grievers or heart grievers. Heart grievers are people like me. I love to talk about my feelings and express them verbally through writing. And then there are head grievers who may not feel as comfortable in verbally or in writing expressing their feelings. They like to take action around their loss. And so whether your listeners are head grievers or heart grievers, I just want to say you have permission to grieve, and there's no one right way to grieve.
I love that. Head or heart. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
It was a lovely conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Midlife Reinvention Podcast with Laverne McKinnon. We dove into some deep topics: imposter syndrome, career transitions, discovering your Ikigai, and even how grief can affect our professional and personal paths. If nothing else, I hope you take away that you're not alone and that you can truly move forward past any setbacks or uncertainty by staying true to your values and your why. Before you go, I want you to invite you to take my career and life fulfillment quiz. It's designed to help you gauge your current satisfaction levels, because sometimes we don't even realize how stuck we are until we see it in black and white. Once you've got that clarity, you can begin taking the steps you need to get unstuck and move forward with more confidence. The link is right here in the show notes. I can't wait to hear your results and cheer you on as you work towards a more fulfilling career and life. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, you have the power to create the life you truly want. Keep going, and I'll see you next time.